I welcome Professor Gilah Yelin Hirsch from the USA to be amongst us. Today she'll share her paintings, her art practice, and then we'll have the question-answer session. Thank you very much, Professor Hirsch.
I must say what an honor it is for me to be here in this city at this time. Also, I want to thank, first of all, Jyotika Sehgal, who made this possible, and for Diwan Manna, who initiated the birth of this event here. I'm incredibly honored to be here. So essentially, I connect things that don't seem to be connected. I'm driven by my curiosity. As I've said earlier, I need to know everything because everything connects in some way or another. And that's been the story of my life. So you'll get a sense of that as I move through about a half an hour of how I've proceeded with my life through various disciplines. And after that, I will show Reading the Landscape, which is a 35-minute film just released this year. And I'm grateful that it's already getting very good awards. So I will start. I also want to say how amazed I am at these fantastic posters. That what a surprise for me. It's great gifts that you're giving me by being here and making me so welcome. Okay. So, from earliest childhood, I was a questioner, and at 6 years old, I was writing essays in 4 languages, and I titled them Enigma. And the question was, for me, there we were at the height of civilization, and we couldn't deal with these issues of love, food, and shelter. And I don't think we're doing much better at this time. Nature was my refuge from early childhood. My father was an invalid. My mother was a renowned writer, but she suffered mental illness, and it was a very abusive childhood. So my gift was to be in the country in the summers, and instead of playing games with my fellow kids, I brought my philosophy books with me as a little girl, and I'd come with these bounds of philosophy books. I was interested in pretty much everything, and my bunkmates all thought I was insane. Maybe I was. And they used to punish me. They threw all the week's garbage on my bed just to say, you know, you're a very different kid. We can't stand you. But I was very filled with the knowledge that I was receiving. Now, as a Jewish child in Montreal, I was sent to a school where I learned the Torah. And at 8 years old, I was realizing that the names and pronouns for God are both male and female. And when I asked my teacher about this, he came down the aisle, picked me up by the hair, and threw me out. And I was never allowed back. And that was the beginning of my feminist interest and pursuit. And not too long ago, I made this painting dealing with exactly this issue. There is an injunction against the voice of a woman that no man should hear the voice of a woman because this would take the man away from his study of sacred things. And I believe entirely that women should be heard everywhere, all the time. And the words there are kol isha, which means voice of a woman. And I made this image of the Torah as a female Torah, and only the words, voice of a woman. And by 10 years old, I was still plagued with these questions of life and death and survival, and why should we go on? And I read that Albert Einstein was the smartest man in the world, and so I had to ask my question to the smartest man in the world, and I wrote a letter. And you can see the rough draft at the bottom there that the day I wrote the letter, I sent the letter, and my mother came home, who was a teacher. She saw the rough draft in the garbage, and she picked it up and saved it. And I asked him how he could reconcile being a scientist and still believing in God of the Old Testament. How could he put those seemingly dichotomous ideas together? Within a week, I received this letter from Albert Einstein, and he said, "Thank you for your letter. Try to form your opinions always according to your own judgment. You have shown in your letter that you're able to do so." The line, "Try to form your opinions always according to your own judgment," has remained with me as the guide of my life. He gave me the encouragement, he gave me the permission, he gave me, okay, you've got some mental capacities, use them. And he died just a few weeks afterward. And I don't think it was cause and effect, but I was so grateful that I had this interchange that has really guided my life. My childhood goal was to become a writer and a psychologist. Eventually and accidentally, I became a multi-hatted artist. So I kept my interest in science, and I see the two, artists and scientists, as complementary. An artist brings abstraction into form, making images, and a scientist brings form into abstraction. So we are dependent on each other. We have different languages, but we are looking at the same issues. While artists use media to align frequencies, layer veils of light and shadow to produce illusions of form that have coherence, dimension, reflection, and refraction, and the presence of substance. So we create illusions, while the scientists explain form by measuring illusions of dimension, reflection, refraction, in a matrix of frequency. So it's the opposite side of talking about reality. I began to paint in 1968 without any prior training as an artist. And by chance, I had taken 3 different BAs, one in medieval history, one in art history, and one in psychology. And I was given a full-on PhD, clinical PhD at Stanford, which is what I thought I wanted to do, but I was married at the time, and my then husband wanted to go to UCLA for the first ever program, PhD in computer-assisted instruction. It was the time of Follow Your Man, and I had taken one painting class as a part of my art history training, and I sent in the 10 paintings I made in that art history class to the MFA program, and lo and behold, I was accepted. And within 1 year, I was showing my paintings at the County Museum, and then the Whitney Museum in New York, and then museums all over the place. So suddenly I had this other career. And these were the first paintings I did, layering light and time. And then I experimented with something called still life. But very soon, I began to see these ordinary objects as unordinary objects. I was a cook. I loved to cook at that time. Women were not then called artists. Women were painting in the bedrooms, in the kitchens. We're not shown. And as I was so enamored of the great big palette of different shapes and forms and colors and textures and the sensuality of food that I manipulated every day, I began to paint these very large paintings of food. And this is the beginning of the feminist art movement. So here I was using tomatoes and eggs as metaphors for women who were trapped by our biology. And similarly, this house arrest, where the scale, all these are very large paintings, about the need to hide the woman behind her biology. And as an art historian, I had been very familiar with the images of the saints in the Middle Ages with the little angels hanging on top, and so I translated into my images. And I looked at ways of remembering different occasions by splitting up the forms. And I also began to experiment with imagining that I place different layers or thicknesses of glass over ordinary objects, and thus causing a distinction in time and space. So my interest in physics was rather large at the time, and this is a way I thought that I could introduce this into quantum physics into my painting. And at the same time, I was beginning to see, well, we all have a different perspective on things. Even though this is an ordinary object, we see it differently. And at the same time, I began to think, well, if I could paint illusions of things that seem to be really real, and one on top of the other, which one is the real one? And from there, I began to feel like I could unfold or change the dimension of one layer of things over another, and again asking, well, which is the reality? And it became obvious to me that at this time, that humans, we can hold various truths at the same time, simultaneous truths, simultaneous realities. This was a radical thought at the time, and sometimes it still is. So these paintings became very renowned, and as I proceeded, I saw the canvas as a metaphor for looking into personality. And each layer of personality had its own metaphorical subject. And so the whole thing became an exploration of the self. In '74, I took my first solo journey into the mountains in my van at the time. And the van and I got accosted by a blizzard, and the van stopped, and I was in it for a night. I knew I had to move out. I began to walk. The last thing I remembered was bending down near a stream, and I was miraculously found 2 days later under a snowbank and revived. And this experience caused me to look further into myself. And I began to experiment with letter forms. I felt that I was looking into my brain and seeing these letter forms. And these forms are a letter that's called Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second one is the dark blue, which is the first letter for the word for water, Mayim. And the third was the three-pointed red form called Sin, which is the first letter of the word for fire, Srefa. So I was looking at these elements and binding them together. At the same time, these white balls seemed to appear, and when I say seem to appear, I learned early on that I need to follow the image wherever it goes, and it's going to take me to places that I could never imagine. So I continued to look further into my brain and painted my names in pomegranate seeds, and also further down into the DNA, and I realized that at any point there has to be at least a relationship of two for life to begin. Life is not a single event, it always has to have a reflection or a partner, otherwise there's entropy. And here's the DNA again. And at this point, it's interesting for me to see these two images side by side. I painted reflections of events in time, and I realized that any crossing of the DNA is going to give you the Hebrew letter, the first letter of the alphabet called Aleph, so that the beginning and DNA are all combined together, and it was a sense of finding a wedding between mysticism and science. I felt like I could look through form and through marrow. And in 1980, I became paralyzed on my left side, and I had the worst of all prognoses. I had two canvases built in my body size. I had my body stenciled in. I stood in front of it, and somebody penciled in the body. And then I worked within the body for about 9 months and taking out the places that looked stifled and strangled until finally there was movement and I was fine. And then I did another one of the same size canvas, again penciled in, self-portrait, same body size. And that really affirmed the sense that I'd come through a very hard time, but that I had power over my own body. So I learned to trust intuition as it was found and expressed in body-related imagery. The image seemed to go underwater, And then I began to think, well, these undersea forms, I could read these forms. They looked like the word for man and woman in Hebrew. And then I continued through the underwater, and suddenly, at some point, I began to see that this figure was stepping out from under the water, and I began long durations of wilderness in Dorland Mountain Arts Colony in Southern California. Now, what I found there was this pond, and I fell in love, literally, with a pond. And I stayed with this pond for 3 years, and I painted it in different times of day and night and seasons. And I began to think that there was something happening, something attracting me in these forms over here of the reeds. I didn't know yet what, and I was still just loving looking at it and painting at it until I began to see there's certain forms that were leaping out at me, and that these forms seemed to appear over and over again. And I thought, well, it seemed like there was some kind of scriptural message being presented to me if I looked long enough at these forms of the reeds breaking in the pond. The longer I stayed alone in wilderness, the more I became entranced by the reflection rather than that which was reflected. And again, I was considering which is the reality. Is it the stick or the shadow or the reflection? Where, again, is the reality? The longer I stayed alone at this pond place, I felt like an isolated soul, just flying soul, disconnected from everything except what I was seeing deeper and deeper in the pond, which was really reflecting what I was seeing in myself. And soon it was evident that just the reflection in the pond gave me both heaven and earth, and only the floating leaves gave me a sense of surface. Very much like human relationships give us the picture of what's happening from the invisible personality to personality. I began to look at the land with the same kind of very acute vision. And in the high mountains of Banff, that's in the province of Alberta, Western Canada, our highest mountains, Rocky Mountains, I traveled these paths into the forest, and I began to see nature presenting me with what seemed like anthropomorphic images, like the hand of nature. In the dark forest, a tiny little shoot grows, even though it would seem impossible, and I imagined that was a metaphor for a human condition when things are really rough, and yet we can see a point of light. And this tree that had its bark eaten off by an elk, the vulnerability of nakedness, sexual attraction, birth, heartbreak, grief, veiled contact, aging together, adjustments in time and light, allegory of marriage, dignity, the spirit in the tree, learning to fly in the forest. I understood that form evokes feeling, and feeling conjures metaphor, and metaphor demands expression. And these 3 lines became really paramount in my view of looking, seeing, feeling, and expression. I went around the world looking at patterns in nature, seeing, again, anthropomorphic forms of male and female, animals, and sometimes it seemed supernatural, and also letter forms. something that reminded me of the letter A, or something that looked like a house kind of shape. This is early forms. And I found these forms everywhere. And it was as if I was already looking for these forms, which I was. And I photographed hundreds and hundreds of shapes in nature, like this, what became evident, it was a Chinese form for a house, roof over person. Here too. The letter A. And then I began walking around with this table of alphabets that traces the Hebrew alphabet for 57 permutations, and actually I found ones far earlier, 1,300 years ago. But this is the earliest form of all these letter forms, and through the permutations they change over time. But I was finding these forms, the original forms, and photographing them. I knew that there was something called the Kabbalah, which is a hermeneutic form of mysticism about visualization and meditation on the form of every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, that alone or in combination changes not only the psychophysiology of the practitioner, but is also believed to change the nature of cosmology in the moment. I saw letter forms everywhere. And I eventually created 2 books with about 1,000 photographs. And I was also reading words at the time and photographing them, including the word for letter, made of the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which I found in the Rocky Mountains. I only photographed things that I found as they were. What if it were true that nature speaks in signs, and that the secret to understanding its language consists in noticing similarities in shape? Look at the form. I had looked at so many alphabets worldwide, and I saw that this was always the case, that what was recognizing, the neurons that were recognizing these forms were identical to the forms themselves. And also the neural processes of perception and cognition were the same as the forms that were recognized. I thought it fantastic that the first form of the last letter of the alphabet, Taf, is identical with the last form of the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, a cyclic representation of the DNA. This was the first photo taken by Rosalind Franklin of DNA, and she was never given credit until about 20 years ago. So by 1981, I had come up with, I thought, was a theory, and I was invited to present it at a conference of 100 scientists from all over the world. And I was scared to death. I thought I would be booed right off the platform. But on the other hand, the theory was accepted into science. And I was asked to give these slideshows. At the time, I was using 4 carousel slide projectors, which were these behemoth machines that I carried all over the world. And I decided I needed to make something more portable, and so I did create this movie, hour-long movie, Cosmography, The Writing of the Universe, which is now all over the world and used in coursework in many kinds of institutions. So I began to understand how to explain this process. We universally recognize external form in the same way because they reflect our hardwired perceptual and cognitive apparatus. But we give meaning to form in cultural context. I began to think, do we see because of what we think, or do we think because of what we see? I spent a year in 15 Asian countries, 86 and 87, and I learned a great lesson. that belief systems are random, contextual, and convenient, and joy is culturally determined, while grief is experienced universally in the same way. So joy is dictated by cultural preference. In one, you want many husbands or many wives, you want sons or you want daughters, sexual preference changes, and gods change every few miles. But grief is experienced universally, and that has to do with loss of contact, rejection, abandonment. So while cultures vary widely, we are fundamentally more alike than we are different. In the East, everybody knows and has always known that forms will change your psychophysiology just by looking at it. In the West, the only understood form affecting psychophysiology was everybody knew that if a man particularly was shown an erotic image, there would be some psychophysiological change. They weren't even giving women the same credit at the time. But everything we see changes our psychophysiology. And this is how art and healing work together, the reflection, connection, and contact with a health-giving image. This is a Navajo healing blanket, and various cultures have always used form as healing medicine, this Tibetan mandala. And then I spent 16 months in the high mountain forest of northern Arizona. I lived in a yurt for a while. I had given up my entire life in Los Angeles, all the comforts of home. I needed to experience the sense of living alone in a forest, living deeply in nature. And I became a deer-like person. Both my last names mean deer, by the way, so I identified with the deer. I lived with the big animals, and they really got to know me, and I got to know them. The forest became my cathedral. I was reading the landscape of the trees in the forest. They were letterforms as well. In that kind of isolation, my painting became much more subconscious, and I was looking deeply into the unknown aspects of my subconscious, surprising myself, where did these images come from, but certainly connected deeply into nature. I was alone in this vast forest, one of the largest forests in the US, and at a certain point this fire broke out, the biggest fire ever in a forest in the US, and I was the sole living creature there. At that point, the chiggers, which are tiny microscopic critters, dove into my eyeballs because that was the only place where water existed, and I became blind for a while. And then the winter came, and I moved into this little shack with no heat or power. That heating unit didn't work out, and I also had to collect these tubfuls of snow every day in order to have water. I walked with the bears, who were very well acquainted with me, and I with them. And we would walk on the same trail together, and these were bears coming out of hibernation who were hungry, and we all just squatted and foraged. I lived with the herding animals, and I learned then that we too are herding animals, in that it's only within the herd that we can be heard. By a year and something into this 16 months, I felt that I had learned everything I needed to learn, that life was difficult, surely, and maybe that was enough life for me. And I dreamed that I saw myself floating over my potentially dead body. And in the dream, I was told that life, the burden of every day, was turning into the gift of having life. And I chose to have life. And it was at that point where I received a letter, an invitation, to attend for the first time ever the Dalai Lama's tantric teaching in Dharamsala. So I left my snow-covered mountaintop, and I went all the way over to Dharamsala and sat with 300 monks for 6 weeks and was able to hear the bodhicitta teachings only because the prior time I had been there, I gave my transistor radio to a young monk who, in the interim, had become the Dalai Lama's amanuensis. And it was only with that kind of radio that one could hear a translation. And so I was given that same old radio back to me. And we were told about these white spheres that are of 2 essences. And we were shown that these spheres start at the crown here, and this was the embodiment of compassion, and that we were to visualize these spheres coming down and nourishing all the different cells, systems, and organs of the body, and eventually coming up the other side, and eventually going out the crown chakra to nourish all sentient beings. So the aspect of being compassionate was to nourish all beings everywhere. I understood then that form, thought, belief, behavior, change, psychophysiology. I had already determined that recognition is proprioceptive, meaning it's felt in the body, hardwired into physiological systems. Therefore, the paradigmatic model of contact and communication must lie submerged in our deeper recesses. I learned that cells whisper together through their cell membranes that vibrate in the electromagnetic field created by the valence of various hormones, minerals, and neurotransmitters. I'm showing you now a group of cells. Here is the soliton, the electromagnetic field. If they have calcium nearby, the cells will contact each other and they will have a party and they will nourish each other. If calcium is not present, then they cannot cross this soliton and they will clone themselves, which is what cancer is. Even at a more subliminal level, but certainly physiological, when the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, if we look at them, when they're working well, they are intertwined like this, or they're spooning like that, but when they're not working well, they are separated and have no relationship. Much like our hardwired physiological systems, our emotional search from birth is for a resonating reflection, not a clone. Micro to macro, all healthy organisms require reflection and communications. Particles, cells, individuals, communities, nations, galaxies, all require connection. From infancy, we model behavior with mirror neurons, and we are actually equipped with mirror neurons for reflection, connection, and contact. We don't want identical reflection because there is no trigger toward life if it's identical, but we do want exactly similar. In psychology or psychiatry, in isolation, we may develop psychopathology. We may become narcissists. We may talk to ourselves, and we may develop multiple personalities, all equivalent to what happens on the cellular level. In the mid-90s, I began a series of paintings that I called the Diamond series, and continued with these, and as always, I never knew what they were, where they came from, but after 9-10 months, I had made these unusual paintings. And in the end of June in '99, I experienced a lethal accident on an extremely remote archipelago in the Pacific Ocean. I had broken pretty much everything, all my ribs, sternum, scapula, crushed heart, crushed head, crushed knees, 5 millimeters of bone fragment in my spinal column, and a flat EKG. And I managed to get myself on will alone back to Los Angeles. And by the way, this is where the Haida Indians and Kwakiutl Indians have lived for 15,000 years. And I was there doing research. So I managed to get myself back to Los Angeles. on will alone and morphine to go. And that's a long way, coming from there all the way down to there. And the first month or two, I had no surgery, and I was given the most dire diagnosis again, that I would be paralyzed from the waist down, that I would not have a mind anymore, that, just awful, awful. I had no surgery. I spent the first month lying still with medical texts and looking at these texts and the images of every cell and system of organ, and making sure that I had a clear mental image in my mind of what the healthy one of those looks like. A very meticulous, focused concentration, meditation on changing the cellular fractures into healthy systems. And after 2 months, I was able to walk to my studio, and I had these very large canvases made, which eventually I called the Diamond series, that had to do with reconstructing my body from the inside out. And I also wrote inside each of these paintings. These paintings are bigger than that. And when the first day there, I couldn't even hold a brush. It was just a miracle, but every day I was intent on healing. And as I painted these paintings, these balls seemed to come up here, and they seemed to arrange themselves in a particular form. And then I realized, well, this is the same pattern that I had been taught about moving compassion around. I also knew that this was the way that calcium moves around the body, and that was necessary for the cells to talk with each other. I also knew that these were acupuncture points and moxibustion points. So all Eastern kind of medicine nestled into the paintings, the healing paintings. And morphage has to do with the distribution of calcium. In one, I had to imagine that I had given myself open heart surgery in order to make sure that the 5 millimeters of bone fragments in my spinal column would attach themselves to the vertebrae, and they did eventually. As I got far stronger, I felt that I was holding the energy in my heart, and that I was once again able to look outside my body into the flora and fauna around me. I was so grateful for getting well, and my intention was, if by getting well I can help others get well, and that remained the goal, which has eventuated. In this painting, I formulated what I believe, and that is that divinity is in humanity, while spirituality is in behavior. This is a painting I call Choice, and every time we breathe, we have a choice whether to take the next breath or not to take the next breath. And we have a sense of imagining that maybe things are better on the other side. But by choosing to have another breath, we have the opportunity to help others. It is our behavior that really shapes what becomes of us. And as we go back into the earth at the end of our lives, we become one with nature. We understand that we are riding bareback on each other's souls. And we of the big brain, we humans, are always looking for the answer, the clarity that we think is just around the corner. And we will build institutions of learning and intellectual knowledge to hope for the moment of enlightenment. And we're thinking, almost I can read this, the Holy Grail, that's got to be the code, but it's not quite legible. And it's never quite legible. We think we've almost got it, but not quite. And we have to continue the search. And we may look for it in moments of mysticism and other forms of mysteries. We imagine other galaxies, maybe it's out there, other dimensions. We conceive of parallel universes. We think of multiple universes. And we're sure that somewhere out there is the answer. But really the answer is in reflection. And the more we understand the nature of reflection, the closer we get to the substance. That all things are made of everything else. We imagine ourselves sometimes as unique, but actually the more we study that, we know that we are reflections of others. And as individuals, we mirror everyone else. And sometimes we're multiples of each other. But really, we are mere mortals in the archaeology of time, facing our final disposition back into nature, where we once again become frequencies. And finally, light. Thank you for your attention. If there are questions, I'd be happy to do what I can.
Usually, all those who pursue a mystical path would also hold that the experience, mystical experience, is beyond language, and it's actually in the realm of silence.
Yes.
That you realize. While what you seem to be doing is finding language of the mystic, right, and relating it to the languages that we ordinary mortals use in ordinary language.
Well, I
Ordinary
really,
life. So the relationship between the mystical and the linguistic, right, is very unusual in your case as against the conventional sort of thing.
yeah. I appreciate your insight, and I agree with you. And I can only tell you that I spent 5 years in silence in nature, and that's where it all became real to me. And that one of the most sublime experiences in my life was when I went to the North Pole, and I lay on the tundra at night. And there, at the top of the planet, the aurora borealis, you could see it all around. And it's all these waving colors and shapes and extraordinary. And when any one of those frequencies of colors touches the ice, a sound is emitted. And that sound moves around the universe. So all these colors and all these sounds of frequencies are tumbling all over the universe. Is that silence? Is that another language? I think there's so many ways to enter into the mysteries, all the mysteries, and they all live in our souls. I thank you for your question, for your comment.
What I can learn out of it is that you, especially as an artist, you have to come out of your comfort zone. You have to go. You have to risk something. You have to be curious. You have to get out of all the normal way of living and give something to your human fellows. And I think this is something very, very good for me, that I have been here and listening to you, and it is very encouraging still. And once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you were here. You are here.
My question is that what did it feel like when you were able to find these answers about the mysteries of the universe and the language and nature and everything that you have theorized? What did it feel like to yourself, finding all those answers?
Thank you for your question. And I have to start by saying I have not yet discovered all the mysteries of the universe. And that's what keeps me going. I'm driven to find out more and more connections. And that's where creativity lies, is in discovering links between things that don't seem to be related, but they are, because everything is related. And I don't think I will ever discover all the mysteries of the universe, but the key thing is always to be searching. And what does it feel like? I'll tell you one instance when it suddenly occurred to me that these forms are the same as the neurons. And the neural processes of perception and cognition, it was a big aha. So there were the two ahas. One was seeing these forms in all alphabets, ancient to modern. And my question was, why did they attract me? If they attracted me, surely they had the same attraction to our ancestors, no matter where in the world our ancestors were, because our physiology was the same and captured our attention. And that was a big aha as I was moving around the world, taking hundreds of photographs. But the second, the question to myself was, why were we attracted to those forms? And then it occurred to me that it had to be a reflective, symbiotic relationship, a reciprocal relationship between the hardwired process of perception and that which is perceived. In the same way, when you have a relationship with someone, you don't have a one-way relationship. That is not a relationship. But if you have give and take, back and forth, it's the same kind of mirroring. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm glad to remember those moments. So thank you for reminding me of them.
Thank you.
Today you are a woman who has experienced so much and you have done so much in your life. You may not have all your answers, we very rarely do. But my question to you would be that from someone who has been in the art world and from someone who has learned so much and grown so much, what would be a message you would like to pass on to someone who might be beginning that journey themselves?
I can only tell you what Albert Einstein told me when I was 10. Always form your opinions according to your own judgment. And the way that you've formulated your question means that you're already thinking in many ways about many things. And undoubtedly you will come up with original, creative versions of, I don't know yet what will be your medium, or maybe many media. But I know that you're already on your way, and trust yourself. And when you look at the history of civilization, it's all the folks who are outside the box that change civilization. It was never the sheep who changed civilization.
Thank you, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask about healing and
Yes.
art.
Yeah.
Now, I personally do believe in that and practice that, and I'm a Reiki practitioner also. So I've seen the healing happen. But medical science still does not kind of accept the sort of connections that, for instance, as you showed in the skeletal system, that the sort of the healing of the spine and various other things which are, seen to be almost kind of irreversible kinds of changes that take place. And is it something in us that we don't want to see, that process of degeneration and decay in ourselves? Is it all, all beauty and regeneration and all that? Or is degeneration and decay also a part of that healing, if you like, or that kind of understanding of how nature works? Is it that we are trying to resist that in some way, or is it that, that anyways medical science will succeed at some point in understanding these things and then accept them? What do you see as a difference? Because you must have encountered people who, didn't believe in this and who felt doctors, for instance, might not believe in it,
I have good news for you in this vein. Now, in 1968, this secret conference was formed in Kansas. It was physicists and psychiatrists who were all studying consciousness. And it was formed because the US government was worried about something called paranormal sorts of things that the Soviets were doing, the Russians were doing during the Cold War. So the question was, what is consciousness? And since the psychiatrists and the physicists were all together, well, consciousness has to do with all sorts of states of being and awareness. And I was the first non-card carrying scientist to be invited to this conference, and I'm still very much a part of it. Now, in the early days, we had people from India, gurus from India, coming and slicing their arms and they didn't bleed. We had other people putting their feet into ice and there was no change. We yelled at spoons and they curled. We walked on fire and didn't get burned. The whole thing was, what is consciousness and how can you use your mind to change your body? And so from things as abstruse as that, in this conference, biofeedback was invented. And biofeedback is now popular culture, and it's used regularly in order to, let's say, drop your blood pressure from a high blood pressure to only mind doing this. So I was a pioneer in all of this world of psychoneuroimmunology, and now in hospitals in the US, before surgery, during surgery, and after surgery, the patient goes through very articulated guided visualizations of what the problem is, what is going to be done during surgery, and what the healing is going to look like after. And then this is repeated. The data on recovery is 1,000-fold stronger than any other than before. So every hospital is using this. I have been working with people who are ill in all sorts of ways all over the world, invited by hospitals to work with and also to train staff and doctors. And what I do, and even as patients as young as 2 and as old, it doesn't matter what the illness is or the ailment is. First of all, kids are never told what's wrong with them. And it is important that everybody know what's inside their bodies. I always have a skeleton present in this sessions so that people can manipulate the skeleton and, oh, I have one of those inside there. You know, people are kept in the dark about what they are. And then for every person, I get a medical text, a pure medical text. And we go around and see what's the problem, and each person tells what the problem is, and we identify it and name it and find it in the text. And then every person, there's a 6-foot piece of white paper on the wall, and every person is traced into the white paper standing forward. And then the task is to reconstruct the body with a healthy whatever it is that wasn't working properly. And the results are just amazing. First of all, there is the recognition that you have power over your own body. Second, that you're steering the direction into a healthy place. And thirdly, always the intentionality is to help others, that you are getting health in order to help others. And that's a very important component. And more, certainly all over the US and also in countries like Germany and France and England, these methods, psychoneuroimmunology is being used in hospitals and by doctors. And as a matter of fact, in LA, UCLA Medical School, for the last 15 years, and not only that medical school, but many other medical schools incorporate what's called expressive therapies into the medical education. And that means understanding the power of mind over the body and working in those ways toward health. There's a center called Integrated Medicine at UCLA, and every possible expressive therapy is used. In fact, I'm going to be speaking at a summit conference on exactly this in April. And many times during the year, I'm all over the world doing different things, but that's a big question now. And surely, you know, this country, India, was the beginning of alternative medicine. And that what came west. And now we're coming east. So we are meeting, finally. And with the influx of Eastern thought that arrived in the 60s, just when quantum physics became the popular way to think about physics, the conflation of the two philosophies merged. And this is what made it possible to think about ordinary things in what we used to think were unordinary ways. So I'm very optimistic. And you know, I have this kind of surmounting belief system that if all the attitudes are clear, then there is no degeneration. And a lot of degeneration happens after an emotional crisis of some sort. And the conflation between onset of cancer, for example, there is very often a 2-year time period between a very traumatic emotional experience. And it's not surprising when your body is in trauma, you know, something may happen. But I'm really glad you asked the question, because I did want to broach it, this whole question, because it's all part of it. And in addition to the theories that I talked about here, I've developed other theories in psychoneuroimmunology, and they are being adopted in many ways, in particularly medical schools and hospitals.